This is the fourth part in our space series, Human Rights in Slovenia. Part 4 is titled Crimes Against Humanity and War Crimes. Hello, Gregory. And we
Hi,
are,
Greg.
with help of Maria and her expertise knowledge, we are enlightening the events of Second World War regarding Slovenes in from the perspective of international law. So, Maria, what have you prepared for us today, please?
Well, thank you, Blaž. And hello, everyone. Today, I want to start out with summarizing what we discussed last week regarding collaboration. And after I go through that with some case examples, then I want to get into the main body of this evening, which will probably take more than half an hour, discussing crimes against humanity and war crimes, the difference between them. And then I want to go over 3 case examples to put it into perspective. So, to reiterate why Blaž and I are doing this before I start, we want Slovenia to become fully democratic. In order to achieve that, we must have open and honest discussions about the past. There are too many misconceptions about what happened, and we'll be talking about some of those this evening. So I'm trying to clear some of that up by adding legal information to the discussion. Slovenians must look hard at the past, acknowledge the crimes that were committed so that they can move forward. So last week we discussed legal collaboration, which is generally defined as intentional cooperation, generally with an occupier that harms the state. We discussed last week how collaboration under international law is irrelevant. And that is because criminal responsibility for crimes committed during war are judged individually, not collectively. The group is not blamed for an individual's crime. No one is going to be charged only with a crime of collaboration in any kind of international tribunal, nor will that happen under a democratic country. The person must have committed an actual crime, which would include acts such as murder, torture, rape, and others. Now we need to apply the law to the facts as we know them. When the war began, it began on April 6, 1941 in Slovenia. Communists in the Soviet Union were already allied with Nazi Germany. Communists had collaborated with the Nazis since 1939, the beginning of the war. Slovenian communists, including partisans later, were allied with the Soviet communists, and they received their training in communism from them. After June 22, 1941, the Soviet Union ended that formal collaboration with Nazi Germany. Slovenians, partisans, pro-communists, however, continued to collaborate with the occupier, which they had been allied with shortly before, from time to time. And when I say occupier, I don't just mean Germany, I mean the Italian occupier as well. And they collaborated with them as needed, and that's documented. Historians have documented those occasions. This collaboration of the partisans made them traitors under definitions of many states to the legitimate government of Yugoslavia and the king. They worked against the Kingdom of Yugoslavia with the intent of overthrowing it and installing a communist form of government. The communists even invented the term White Guard in 1941, 2 years before the Slovenian Home Guard was even created. This is a term that comes from, and it's rhetoric that comes from the Soviet Union, and it was used to describe their white Russians, people who opposed the Red Communists. However, under modern international law, there is no case to be made against the communists or the partisans for collaboration with the occupiers. And that is because collaboration by itself is not an international crime. Now we need to apply the same standard to the Home Guards. Collaboration with the occupiers by the Home Guard cannot be considered a crime by itself. The Home Guard accepted weapons from the Germans in order to protect themselves from partisan attacks. That's tactical collaboration, as it was with the partisans. And such collaboration cannot be considered a crime in and of itself. I also want to reiterate some of the comments I made last week regarding the legality of war. Fighting for an army is legal. Under international law, which was applicable during the Second World War, there was no rule prohibiting one organized armed force from fighting another military force during either an international or an internal armed conflict. The Hague Regulations, and I'm referring to those from 1907, they did not criminalize participation in hostilities. Instead, they regulated the manner in which hostilities were conducted. Likewise, the Charter of the International Military Tribunal defined war crimes as, quote, violations of the laws or customs of war, unquote, not participation in military operations. So this distinction is important. This distinction between lawful, combatancy, and criminal conduct. It remains one of the central principles of international humanitarian law. Soldiers may lawfully fight opposing soldiers, defend military positions, gather intelligence, participate in military operations, all without committing crimes. These are not war crimes. War crimes arise only when combatants violate the laws and customs of war. For example, as we've been discussing, murdering civilians, executing prisoners of war, torturing detainees, committing rape, deporting civilian populations, and other acts. So to summarize, it was legal for the Home Guards to fight the partisans during World War II, as long as they did not murder civilians, torture prisoners, torture civilians, etc. It was also legal for the partisans to fight the Home Guard, as long as they did not murder civilians, torture prisoners, etc. So that sums up the analysis that I'd wanted to provide from last week. Now I want to move on to the main body of what we're discussing today, which is both crimes against humanity and war crimes. I'm going to provide definitions for both, and then I want to go through 3 case studies so we can look at it from facts and apply the law to the facts. So the first one is I want to define and go over the factors that are looked at when considering whether a person, an individual person, can be charged with crimes against humanity. Now, the modern accepted definition is quite new from 2002, around when the Rome Statute went into force, Article 7 of the International Criminal Court. A crime against humanity is any of the specified acts committed as part of a widespread or systemic attack directed against any civilian population with knowledge of the attack. Now, I'll just say as a background, working at the ICTY, where I was there for 3 years, 1994 to 1997. I was involved in many cases where indictments were issued. I wrote some of the initial draft indictments myself. The most common charge was crime against humanity. Even though many of the crimes had been committed during war, it's just that crimes against humanity was really applicable during the 1990s war. So the specific acts that are looked at, that a prosecutor will look at when deciding whether to charge an individual with crimes against humanity, include murder, extermination, enslavement, deportation, imprisonment, torture, rape, persecution of an identifiable group on political grounds. That's important for a case we're talking about now. Enforced disappearance of persons and other acts. So the key elements that the prosecutors look at, the prosecutors must prove that there was an attack directed against a civilian population. They must prove that the attack is widespread or large scale or systematic. It doesn't have to be both. The accused committed one of the prohibited acts, and they must show that the accused knew that the act was part of the broader attack. Now, war crimes, which I did give a slight definition of the fifth armed conflict. These two categories overlap, but they protect different legal interests. In general, war crimes regulate how wars are fought. They prohibit unlawful conduct during armed conflict, whereas crimes against humanity may occur during the war, but they can occur during peacetime under modern international law. War crimes protect persons and properties under the laws of armed conflict, whereas crimes against humanity protect civilian populations from large-scale or systematic attacks. Now, here's an important one for a number of the crimes that occurred during the war in Slovenia. A war crime can consist of a single unlawful act, such as the murder of a single prisoner of war or torture of a detainee. Whereas crimes against humanity require that the criminal acts be part of a widespread or systemic attack on civilians. Under war crimes, victims may include enemy combatants who are wounded or captured, prisoners of war, civilians, protected property. But under crimes against humanity, victims are primarily civilians who are targeted as part of the broader attack. And these are governed, war crimes are governed principally by the Hague Regulations, Geneva Conventions, Rome Statute, and crimes against humanity governed principally by customary international law. So that goes back a number of years, the Nuremberg Charter, ICTY, and Rome Statute, among others. So what is the relationship between these two different kinds of charges? The same conduct may constitute both a war crime and a crime against humanity. For example, the torture or murder of civilians during an armed conflict may qualify as a war crime because it violates the laws of war. But simultaneously, it may be also a crime against humanity if it forms part of a widespread or systemic attack against a civilian population. In summary, the war crimes regulate how wars are fought. They prohibit unlawful conduct during armed conflict. Crimes against humanity address large-scale or systemic attacks against civilian populations, regardless of whether those attacks occur during war, under modern or under modern international law. And the distinction reflects the different purposes of the two bodies of law. One governs the conduct of hostilities, while the other condemns organized campaigns of persecution and violence directed at civilians. I'm going to talk a little about what the definition of civilian is. There are three cases that I want to go through. First one is Sveti Ur. Second one will be battle and massacre at Turjak. And the third one will be the post-World War II massacres. So to check in with Blaž to make sure you can still all hear me. Blaž, can you give us a little bit of the background of what Sveti Ur represents and what happened?
Yeah, Sveti Urh, or in German Ulrich, is still a church on the eastern slopes above Maria u Polju, or Polje field. And this church was occupied by home guards, and it became a place of terror for population. At least this was the perspective of those who were fighting with the Liberation Front, Osvobodilna Fronta. So there are historically confirmed cases of torture of activists, of illegal fighters, to extort confessions or information on the network, the red illegal network during the occupation. On the other hand, Sveti Urh has historiographically still a humongous black hole because there are a number of victims buried around the church in the woods, but historiographically, these remains have yet, after 8 years, not been properly researched, or even the origin of the people is not confirmed. They might there might be cases that even the partisans buried afterwards their own fallen ones and ascribed those victims to the activities of the Home Guard. So this much for Urch.
Okay, thank you, Blaž. Yeah. Because I'm going through it, this is a legal analysis. When I speak, I will be saying these are the following under this kind of case scenario. But I welcome that introduction. I use this because the Home Guard is frequently associated with alleged war crimes committed against partisans in this location, and that would have occurred between 1943 and 1945. It's also alleged that there were members of, Blaž referred to illegal fighters. I assume that you include the Black and others.
No, so-called illegals,
Yeah.
illegalci, who were the activists of the Communist Party, of the Liberation Front, which Communist Party was the leader of and self-proclaimed leading force.
All right. For this case example, we're just going to give a set of presumed facts, and it doesn't mean that they are exactly correct. I just use examples so that I can talk about the law. There were a number of allegations that members of the Slovene Home Guard and others who were anti-communist detained supporters of the Slovenian partisans, and they interrogated, tortured them, and executed them there. And as Blaž said, the number of actual victims is a matter of discussion. It's not agreed upon. So, assuming these general facts, if these acts occurred as have been documented by some historians, they would constitute war crimes for several reasons. The first one is torture and cruel treatment. The laws and customs of war enforced during World War II prohibited torture and the infliction of unnecessary suffering on detainees. That includes beatings, mutilation, and other forms of abuse. They were all unlawful, even in 1943. Some of the acts alleged include murder of detainees, persons who have been captured or detained. Even if they were fighting for the partisans, they were no longer legitimate military targets. And this is an important point. Deliberately killing prisoners or civilians in custody without judicial process violates customary international law and the Hague Conventions of 1899-1907. There were allegations of summary executions. Executing suspected partisans or civilian supporters of them without trial constitutes unlawful killing. Even where a person was suspected of aiding enemy forces, punishment required a legal process, which did not happen. Immediate execution is not permitted under international law. The fourth reason these most likely are war crimes is the mistreatment of civilians. Civilians who were not directly participating in hostilities were protected under the laws of war. Arresting civilians, torturing, killing them because of suspected political sympathies would violate these protections. And I'm talking about the law as it existed in 1943, 1945. Now, moving to modern times, modern international humanitarian law reaches the same conclusions, just using different statutes. under the statutes of the ICTY, where I worked, the Rome Statute, the International Criminal Court, torture, cruel treatment, murder of detainees, summary execution are all recognized as war crimes when committed during an armed conflict. So it is important, very important to note that these alleged crimes do not establish collective criminal responsibility for all members of the Slovene Home Guard. Modern international criminal law is based on individual criminal responsibility, meaning liability attaches to the person who ordered, committed, or participated in these acts, and not to everyone in the military organization. Likewise, documented crimes committed by partisan units elsewhere do not diminish or excuse crimes committed at Sveti Ur. Each incident must be assessed independently based on the available evidence and the applicable law. So to summarize this case, accordingly, if the reported torture, killings, and executions at Sveti Ur are accepted as established by historical evidence, these acts would be characterized under international humanitarian law as war crimes because of the treatment of persons in custody, not because of the existence of combat between the opposing forces. And again, combat was legal. So that's the summary of the first case. Now I want to move on to the second case, which the battle and
May I just add one fact
Yeah.
which I just figured out?
Yeah.
I was checking Sveti Urh and also Turjak that you will be speaking about.
Yeah.
And as I read, it's on the same date, that's 19th of September, 1943. There were actually two large fights among Slovenes, and the first one was the most important was Turjak, but at the same time there apparently was also an attack against the church Sveti Urh. The fort, let's say they made a fortress out of church. So also the 4th Battalion of Cankareva Brigade, Brigade of Ivan Cankar, but we need to know that 4th Battalion means large exaggeration in numbers. So there were 36 men in Sveti Urh, and 19 partisans were killed trying to attack them, but they were not successful at the end. So now we go to Turjak, I believe, which also fell on 19th of which did fell on 19th of September 43. Please.
43. Okay. I want to use this as a second example of war crimes. Now, in this particular case, there are two distinct phases. The called the Battle of Turjak, and then the second phase is that there was a massacre. And it is important to separate these two under the laws of war. The military siege and assault on the castle itself was a legitimate military engagement between armed forces. That is not illegal. The massacre, the treatment of the prisoners, they had surrendered to the partisans. After the defenders surrendered, that is the aspect that is considered a war crime. From the perspective of modern international humanitarian law, the battle itself was not unlawful merely because one side defeated the other. It's because combatants can attack legitimate military objectives, including fortified positions defended by enemy forces. The legal issue arises only once the resistance ends, and the resistance did end at Turjak.
Might I just add, please?
Yeah, can you
very
add
important.
how the surrender happened?
Just to put numbers.
Sure.
Besides,
Yeah.
There were 700 prisoners,
Yeah.
and out of them, around 400 were later executed with or mostly without a judicial process.
Right. And do you know about when they surrendered? Was there 300 or 400 that surrendered at the beginning?
No, 700
Total.
were 700 were in captured,
Right.
and out of them 400 have been executed later
Right.
on.
Okay.
So to compare it with the numbers on Sveti Urh, which was much closer to Ljubljana, and the intensity in numbers was much lesser.
Yes, I believe that the agreed upon number of victims of partisans at Sveti Urh on both sides is approximately 130. So yes, it is much less. So the events at Turiak are considered a war crime for several reasons. The first one is a killing after surrender. Once the defenders laid down their arms or they were captured, they became legally prisoners or prisoners out of combat or de combat. Under the customary laws of war, which were enforced in 1943, they could no longer lawfully be killed simply because they had fought for the opposing side. The winning side is required to undertake certain measures, which they did not do. The second reason it's considered a war crime is because there were summary executions without trial. The historical evidence indicates that numerous of them, you said about 400, were executed shortly after capture rather than being afforded any form of judicial process. So the execution of prisoners without a regularly constituted court has long been regarded as contrary to the laws and customs of war. That was the case in 1943 and long before that as well. The third reason it's considered a war crime is because there was no military necessity. Once prisoners are disarmed and under guard, military necessity no longer justifies the use of lethal force against them. Their continued detention is the lawful course, which did not happen here. And the fourth reason it's considered a war crime is due to the mistreatment of prisoners. The laws of war require that captured combatants be treated humanely. Deliberate killing or abuse of prisoners violated the established customary rules even before the Geneva Conventions of 1949. It's important to distinguish these legal questions from the political affiliations of the defenders. Whether they belong to the Slovene Home Guard, Slovene Chetniks, or other anti-communist forces does not determine whether they were entitled to protection or not after capture. Under the laws of war, legal protection after surrender depends on a person's status as a captive, not the perceived justice or injustice of their cause. It's very clear, and the combatants know this. Certainly, the commanders know this. Modern international criminal law reinforces this distinction. The statutes of the ICTY, the Rome Statute, the current International Criminal Court all recognize the murder or execution of persons who have surrendered or are otherwise out of combat. These are war crimes. So, to sum up this case, from a legal standpoint, the siege and the capture of Turiak Castle constituted a battle, and that's a legal battle. But the execution of the prisoners after the surrender constituted a separate criminal act. And it's this later conduct, not the military assault itself, that is characterized as a war crime under both customary international law and modern international humanitarian law. The third case is the one we will be talking most about during this series, the post-World War II massacres in Slovenia committed by the Yugoslav communists. And these constitute a crime against humanity. So going back to our initial definition, I'll be going through that. Under modern international criminal law, there's a strong legal argument that the post-Second World War II massacres are a crime against humanity. Communists killed approximately 100,000 people. I mean, the historians have different numbers, and they still haven't found everybody. While the legal analysis depends on evidence relating to particular incidents, many of the known facts correspond closely to elements of crimes against humanity as developed by the International Military Tribunal, the ICTY, and the Rome Statute. So here are the following arguments to be made as to why the post-World War II massacres committed by the Yugoslav communists, after the British repatriated them, including many home guards, constitute a crime against humanity. The killings, number one, the killings were part of a widespread or systemic attack against a civilian population. Again, crimes against humanity require proof that crimes are committed as part of a widespread or systemic attack against the civilians. The executions occurred across hundreds of locations throughout Slovenia, not just in one place, and neighboring regions as well. Tens of thousands of people, maybe 100,000 people, were killed over a relatively short period in Slovenia itself. Victims included not only captured members of the Slovene Home Guard, but also civilians, women, clergy, refugees, civil servants, intellectuals, and also minors. The killings followed a centrally organized policy carried out by communist security organs and military units rather than isolated acts of revenge. The ICTY, where I worked, repeatedly held that an attack does not mean a military attack, but a campaign involving multiple acts of violence against civilians. So that's what the definition of widespread or systemic attack means, not a military attack. The second argument to be made is that many of the victims were civilians. One of the most important legal questions actually concerns whether the victims were civilians. Although many members of the Home Guard had served in armed formations during the war, by the time they were executed, the war had ended. They had surrendered. They had been disarmed or handed over their weapons, and they were under the complete control of the Yugoslav authorities. That means, under modern international humanitarian law, persons who have surrendered or are detained are no longer lawful military targets. Thousands of those killed had never been combatants at all either, including women, children, refugees, priests, government employees, and family members. The presence of former soldiers among the victims does not prevent crimes against humanity from applying. The ICTY held that civilians remain the primary protected population, even if some non-civilian attack, that's not a military attack, it's a systemic attack against a civilian population. The third factor that makes this an argument for crimes against humanity is that the victims were murdered without judicial process. This is probably the clearest criminal aspect. Most were transported to forests, abandoned mines, right, Kurayama, tied together, shot, thrown into pits, buried alive, killed without charges, denied defense counsel, denied appeals, and denied individualized determinations of guilt. Modern criminal law rejects collective punishment. Criminal responsibility must be individual. The fourth argument is that the killings were politically motivated. Remember, I mentioned that before under crimes against humanity. The evidence suggests that many victims were selected, possibly almost all of them, because they belonged to groups regarded as political enemies of the new communist regime. Victims included persons associated with anti-communist political parties, religious organizations, priests, former government institutions, refugee organizations, and perceived class, and is expressly recognized as a crime against humanity. That's why I said that this is a very clear case. The fifth argument is that collective guilt cannot justify the killings. And we talked about this in one of our earlier sessions, how modern international law has rejected collective guilt and requires individual criminality. At the ICTY, we repeatedly emphasize, the judges emphasize that criminal responsibility is individual. Membership in an organization does not establish criminal guilt. So membership in a home guard does not establish any kind of criminal guilt. Each person's conduct must be proved individually, and that wasn't done. Most post-war executions appear to have been based simply on membership in the Slovene Home Guard or whoever was with them at the time. A sixth factor in determining whether this was a crime against humanity is that the killings were organized and systemic. The executions were not spontaneous. This was not neighbor against neighbor. For the most part, these were organized by security forces, OSNA, KNOI, the political party police of the Yugoslav communists. They organized prisoner transports. They organized execution sites in advance, and they prepared them. They prepared burial pits in many areas. Many executions occurred simultaneously or within close time frame of each other across Slovenia. So these characteristics strongly support the systemic element required for crimes against humanity. A seventh factor, and I'm going through 9 in case you think I'm going to do 25 or so, just 9, is enforced disappearances and concealment. Many victims simply disappeared. I've heard that from so many people. I've never seen the family again. Families received no notification of their family member being taken. They were simply gone, or they were given false explanations. They were prevented from learning burial locations and were forbidden from mourning them in public. Mass graves were deliberately concealed for decades, and a number of them are still concealed. Modern international criminal law recognizes enforced disappearance as a crime against humanity when committed as part of a widespread or systemic attack. The eighth factor in determining whether to charge crime against humanity is that the attack continued after the war ended. This is an important legal point. Crimes against humanity do not require that the war is ongoing. It can occur during peacetime or at the end of the war, which is when these post-World War II massacres occurred. And they were directed largely at persons who are already under state control. And those are considered, again, civilians. Just because they were former combatants, now they're considered civilians. And this distinguishes them from battlefield deaths. These are crimes. Most battlefield deaths are not crimes under international law. The ninth and final factor I'm going to go over is that murder is a crime against humanity. And that's a principal underlying offense. The elements are straightforward. Victims were intentionally killed. They were under the control of the perpetrators, the communists. The killings formed part of a widespread or systemic attack. And the perpetrators knew that they were participating in that broader attack. That meets all the elements to charge these individuals with crimes against humanity. These elements closely mirror the definitions applied by the ICTY and later codified in the Rome Statute. So that's quick. In later sessions, I'll be discussing crime against humanity, war crimes, and so that people have a sense of the distinction and how they can be applied differently to crimes or alleged crimes that occur during a war and after the war. All right, Blaž, I've gone through what I have prepared. Now it's your turn.
Well, I will have 2-3 brainstorm ideas.
Right.
But first, is this pravna praksa still valid to be published soon?
Yes.
Can we mention that?
Yes, you can go ahead. I told you, right?
Well, I just remember that on 9th of July, there will be an article by you.
Yes.
But if you have it confirmed.
Yes, it's going to be published on Thursday, and that one's on rejecting collective guilt. And we discussed that, a part of that last week.
Excellent.
But it'll be just pure law. I won't be arguing for the Home Guards or against them. When I write legal papers, I'm just going to discuss the law, and people can apply the law to the facts of the law. Go ahead. Can you hear me?
My mic was off. So let me just give you a small additional information on Turjak and Kočevje process. So the number I've asked Grok actually that the number of fallen has not been as big as I imagined before. In the communist times, they used to say, yes, there were so many partisans killed during the attack on the castle Turjak, Auersperg, that we felt that revenge was in place. But there are additional aspects to the legal aspects to the process that went on after the capture in town of Kočevje, or Gotche for Germans. That process is still, let's say, let's put it mildly, it's not classified completely as valid, but the number, as we said, the number of captured was around 700, but the military circumstances were not very favorable on one hand. Yes, Italy has collapsed. Italian army has given artillery, guns to bombard the castle Turjak. So the partisans would not succeed if there would not be the collaboration by Italian captures. But the later proceedings were made in haste. Were made on, let's put it, beyond the edge of legality, legitimacy as well. So the date was around September 1943. And now we will jump to my primal question about, you were talking about crimes against humanity, and constantly I'm being reminded by the fact that I know something, a little bit of definitions of the Convention on Genocide came into effect on, as I see it, 12th of January 1951. But there were elements of, as you put it, national and religious group. So it was Slovenes, it was Christian Catholic Slovenes that were the victims of the killings by the partisans, by the atheist communists. So and about the intent to destroy, because there must be intent to destroy a whole or a part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. And regarding the intent, I might add the famous letter of Edvard Kardel to Boris Kidrič, and this letter was posted on 25th of June 1945. So these are 80 years, 81 year anniversary around those times. And Kardel, who was the leading communist in Slovenia after Tito, he wrote explicitly to Boris Kidrič, the president of Slovene socialist government. Therefore, you have no reason why to be so slow in cleansing as until now. So my question is, could it be possible to consider also the elements of genocide? Please, Maria. And then I would ask Gregory to put some comments afterwards.
I could make a session just on it, because it requires more consideration. But I'll just say right now that is something that is determined at the court. It's not something that I've considered for this. Often genocide is not applied. Also, based on, you mentioned religion, but political is not included, which would be the major reason why they were killed, for political reasons. So I've put my energy into describing crime against humanity, which I think is quite sufficient. Just because genocide, that has to go to court and is determined by the court itself. I can talk about that more another time, but I want to organize my thoughts on it, no, not just talk off the top of my head. But those are the
these
two main reasons. But I did want to describe and compare the post-World War II massacres to the Srebrenica crime against humanity, which I can do for 5 minutes. If Greg wanted to say something, can go ahead, and then I can continue.
Let me just try and put a little context in this.
Yep.
If you go up and down Eastern Europe, you're going to see this is the communist playbook. You kill the likely leaders who are going to try and prevent you from taking over. And there's examples all over. In fact, what's interesting is if you go through the capitals of some former Soviet republics into Eastern Europe, you will almost always see museums against the communists. And I just made a list as I was sitting here: Prague, East Germany, Budapest, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia. When the Soviet army was approaching Warsaw, there was an uprising by those opposed to the Nazis, and they basically let it play out, hoping that the Germans and the anti-communists would basically kill each other, and then they can and did swoop in afterwards. So what we're seeing here is not some individualized justice going on. You're looking at someone playing Stalin's playbook, that they go in there, this is what you do, you take the likely leaders, and the Domobranci were clearly in that group, as were many other other targeted victims. And so when you put in that context, it really, all the defenses fall away. This was a deliberate effort to disarm and then eliminate their proposed opponents. The second piece I want to throw into this, just to put some more color on it, is, keep in mind, this is all happening at the end of World War II, and the Nazis were committing war crimes willy-nilly in Slovenia. We've got the entire effort to depopulate the center to provide Lebensraum for the Germans. We have, in, I believe, February of 1945, the repercussions in Celje, when a German officer was killed. I believe they grabbed 100 innocent civilians and shot them. And so we know that those were happening. And to sit down and to say that, well, the Domobranci were committing war crimes in that background is nuts. They were, they were not taking part in those kinds of activities at all. We all know what the war crimes look like. We know what a crime against humanity looks like. And Marie, I think you've defined those super well and very clearly. And clearly the folks that were shot don't fit any of these definitions at all, while the perpetrators certainly do.
Yeah. Yeah, those are all good points. It's good to remember, keep in mind, I mean, the perspective that you brought in also last week in looking around Europe. What does Europe do? Do they have museums against communism? That's a good idea. As far as targeting the civilians, targeting the population, targeting the leaders. I mean, the book I wrote on my grandfather, Velikonja, last year, he had committed none of these crimes. I mean, even at the law of the time, and the Slovenian Supreme Court said that he was targeted simply because he was the most outspoken anti-communist. And it's always good to keep mentioning the Nazis and mass crimes that they did, committing war crimes around Slovenia. And also the retribution. There was a lot of hostage killing, right? If one Italian was killed, they'd kill 10 of the hostages. My father was held in 1942 in one of the Lubana prisons by the Italians as a hostage, right? Every time an Italian soldier got killed, they killed 10 of them. And all that is illegal, and that's being done by the occupiers at all times. Yes.
And if you look at, it goes even beyond the Domobranci. We'll take my family, Dr. Merschol. He was in his early 50s, I would guess, 4 kids. He was a doctor. He was not a combatant at all. He treated all comers. He helped Allied pilots escape, and we've got affidavits to establish that. He did absolutely nothing wrong, and yet the whole family was on the list. This was not some effort at some extrajudicial justice. It was rather a wholesale attempt to eliminate anyone who might be an opponent.
Yes, and then those are excellent examples. I think I have the documentation regarding your grandfather. Right. And that's true. On my maternal side, my grandparents did not take one side or another. There were merchants throughout the war. Yet at the end of the war, they were still targeted by the communists because they considered them bourgeois. They had money. They took my grandmother's grand piano and their properties, and so that went on as well. Confiscation of property that had nothing to do with them fighting against the partisans.
Yeah, well, can we judge that partisans or communists were primarily struggling for power and to rob or to grab as much of material wealth as possible?
They certainly did a lot of that, grabbing material wealth. Very true.
The grabbing the material wealth is, I guess I'd say that is what it is. It happens a lot in history. And, I mean, my family left Slovenia destitute. But from my perspective, that it pales in comparison to the taking of human lives, particularly on such a vast scale. You get the spoils of war, I get that. But when you're taking a bunch, and even then you take a possession, you've taken a possession, you can use it. I don't like it, but it's not the worst thing in the world. But when you're
Yeah,
taking
but
someone who's disarmed and who is innocent, I mean, you've not proven to have done anything, and then to shoot them and do this on a large scale, that is where the tragedy takes place.
yeah, but if you are committing a large crime and you have very bad consciousness about that, then the next logical step is to remove all the possible witnesses or any trace of a possibility of you returning the power back to somebody else in the democratic process.
There was a joke in East Germany regarding the Trabant vehicle, and it was if it doesn't have one, it can't break, which is actually a great joke in my mind. But I think that they had the same view
That was
towards,
Trabi.
yeah.
Yeah.
And if you've ever seen one, it certainly looked like it. They live by that. But I think they had the same feeling towards their opponents. If the opponent is dead, they're not going to oppose you.
Correct.
Well, no man, no problem, as Joseph Stalin said.
Yeah, very true. Blaž, do I have time to talk about Srebrenica for a few minutes?
Yes, please do.
Yeah, I just want to bring it into context since we're doing context the last 10 minutes here. Because of the 1990s war in the former Yugoslavia, many people have heard about the Srebrenica, which was a crime against humanity. This was a wholesale attack by Serbs, Bosnian Serbs, but also from Serbia, against thousands of Muslim population in the eastern town of Srebrenica in Bosnia. And it occurred during the time when they had Dutch peacekeepers in the town. And they were the ICTY charged, and people were found guilty for crimes against humanity in that massacre. And I just want to give some comparison to the crimes against humanity that I've just been discussing for the post-World War II crimes, and where Slovenians and others were killed. Again, crimes against humanity are not limited to civilians, women, children. Most of those, or almost all those killed in Srebrenica, it's over 7,000 Muslim men. They had separated the women from the men. And so there were no women killed in the massacre. And over a period of about 3 or 4 days, if I recall, Bosnian Serbs detained them and then systemically killed over 7,000 of them. They had been disarmed, and there were a few survivors, and that's how we got the witnesses on them. But I wanted to make the point that although that was really a Bosnian Muslim army, they were not treated as active combatants. The perpetrators were charged of crimes against humanity, which again, the focus is on the CCTY. The tribunal found that after the fall of Srebrenica, which was on July 11, 1995, thousands of Bosnian Muslim men were separated from women and children, captured after surrendering, captured while fleeing, or otherwise detained, and they were under the control of the Bosnian Serb forces. Once they were captured, they laid down their arms. International humanitarian law no longer treats such persons as lawful military targets. So even though, as I said, the vast majority of them had been soldiers, their execution was not considered a battlefield killing, and it's not a legitimate killing. That's why it's a crime against humanity. Crime against humanity requires an attack on the civilian population, and not every victim has to be a civilian, and that was proven as well. They're looking again at the overall character of the attack, not technically looking at each individual victim to see if they are all civilians, but they were disarmed soldiers at that point. And the Bosnian Muslim population of Srebrenica was regarded as a civilian community that by the ICT included it, that it remained a civilian enclave. Many of the men who were executed had actually never fought. They were mobilized civilians because really all men had to fight, whether they wanted to or not. They included local officials who were murdered. They included teenagers, elderly men, or men who had surrendered. And again, under the laws of war, a surrendered soldier has to be treated in accordance with the laws of war and customs of war, and that was violated. So even if every victim had been a soldier, and this is important to think about with the post-World War II massacres in Slovenia around 1945, and the ICTY found in Srebrenica, even if every victim had been a soldier, the killings were still war crimes. This is an important point because it prohibits executing prisoners of war or captured fighters. And the executions constitute murder as a war crime, willful killing, denial of fair trial, and you cannot execute prisoners. They were only charged with crimes against humanity, not war crimes. That was because the ICTY concluded that the executions were only one component of a widespread and systemic attack against women, children, and the civilian population. That's pretty much a summary. I find it, Jože Dajman, if you're listening, hello, Jože. Frequently, when he speaks, he's the former chairman of the Slovenian Concealed Mass Graves Commission and has headed the museums in Ljubljana in Slovenia. He frequently says that the 1945 post-World War II massacres constitute 15 Srebrenicas. And I would agree with him. And there's so much greater in Slovenia than in Srebrenica. But as I've just gone through, are very, very similar. And that's why I say that the post-World War II, 1945 massacres definitely constitute a crime against humanity. And I'm basing that a lot on the ICTY jurisprudence of Srebrenica. Okay, that's my Srebrenica presentation. Go ahead, Blaž.
Well, thank you very much. I might just add that Jože Dejman is now also politically exposed right in these days. The Minister of Culture has appointed him as I don't know the English, VD, executive director, but not yet formally appointed, of the Museum of Slovene Independence, because Slovenia also is one of the single country not to have a museum regarding such a period in the history of a nation. So if anyone else wants to ask a quick question. A few seconds you have. Otherwise, I would thank Gregory and ask him for his last comments today, and invite you, Gregory, to join us again. Hopefully, we are making a great team for now, I would say. Thank you. Please.
And thank you as well. And I think just we're talking about these crimes that are here. Obviously, the people that committed them are long since gone. And I think the important thing here is that we recognize what happened, call it out for what it was. As I said before, pray a prayer for the dead, both the guilty and the non-guilty, and move on. This is a sad part of the country's history, and I think once it's behind it, there are brighter days ahead.
So, study and pray. Maria, please.
Thanks, Greg. I think it's always good to remind everybody and remind ourselves of why we're doing this, and that we very much hope that this can become a much less of a minor topic in the future, that there's full democracy, and that the country can move ahead with day-to-day issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much. With this, we conclude fourth part of our series. Today, we spoke about crimes against humanity and war crimes. Thank you very much also to those who will listen to this space on YouTube or else. So everybody invited for next Tuesday, I believe. Maria, same time, same
Yes.
place.
Yes, thank you very much, Blaž. Did an
Thank you.
excellent job.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Good night, everyone.